The first shot hit him square in the chest. I heard the bullet strike, the same flat slap a rifle makes against wet hide, and the thing simply rocked back on its heels, straightened again, and kept watching us. Ridley Corwin levered another round into his Winchester and fired a second time. Same sound, same result. Then the rest of us opened up. I remember the smell of cordite hanging in the fog that would not lift. I remember the way the muzzle flashes lit the black spruce behind it. And I remember thinking, very clearly, almost calmly, that whatever was standing at the edge of our lamplight did not belong in any world I had been taught to believe in. We were 12 men on a surveying crew on a ridge in interior Labrador, 360 miles from the nearest paved road. It was the 14th of August, 1949. By the time we fired our last round, the thing that had come up out of the fen had absorbed somewhere between 11 and 14 rifle bullets at a range of less than 50 feet. And not one of us, not Corwin, not Hutchison, not Silas Benoit, who had trapped that country for 30 winters, could find a single drop of blood on the moss where it had been standing. It turned around without any hurry at all, and it walked back down into the muskeg on its own 2 legs. And that was the moment I understood that we were going to leave Station 14 without finishing the work we had been sent to do. I need to slow this down and tell it properly, because the shape of what happened at Station 14 only makes sense if you understand how ordinary the first week felt. We were a Dominion geodetic crew, 12 men in total, assigned to establish a triangulation station on an unnamed ridge above a body of water the charts called Tessick Brook. Our task was to clear sightlines through the black spruce, set up a theodolite on a masonry pier we were meant to pour from bagged cement flown in by float plane, and take angle readings against 2 reference stations on ridges we could not even see on the first 3 days, because the fog sat on us like a wet wool blanket. The ridge itself had no proper name on any map I have ever held. Someone in Ottawa had written the number 14 next to a black circle on a survey sheet, and that was what we called the place. Station 14. 17 days is how long we were supposed to stay. We stayed for 12. In those 12 days, I watched a rational, careful, 30-year veteran of the survey branch begin to keep a sidearm under his bedroll where his boots normally went. I watched a French-Canadian axeman from Rimouski, who had never in his life been afraid of a forest, stop going to the latrine alone. And I watched an old Métis trapper who had walked every ridge within 100 miles of us quietly rebuild his rifle rounds from scratch one afternoon without explaining why he thought the factory loads would not be enough. The radio was a surplus RCAF field set that Thorne Hutchison, our radio operator and senior instrument man, nursed along with the patience of a man raising a sick child. In the daytime, it gave us nothing. Atmospheric noise, static layered on static, the white roar of a country too far from any other country. After full dark, it would sometimes pull in faint traffic from Goose Bay, or, once, from a weather station the Americans were still running on Baffin Island. Those windows were short, 10 minutes, 15, never predictable. Thorne kept a schedule and tried to match the band openings to the Dominion Observatory's propagation forecasts, which had been printed in Ottawa in June, and which, out there in August, were worth approximately what the paper itself was worth as kindling. After the 14th, after what I have told you about the rifles and the fog and the thing that would not bleed, our entire plan for getting out of Station 14 alive rested on Thorne's ability to raise a human voice through that radio between the hours of roughly 1 and 3 in the morning. I want you to hold that picture in your mind for a moment. 12 men on a ridge, no road out. A float plane 3 days away at best. A radio that worked for maybe 20 minutes a night if the sky was kind. And something in the muskeg that now understood, I believe this to be literally true, that our guns did not function against it in the way guns are supposed to function. That was the situation. This is how we got into it. My name is Evan Oakley. In the summer of 1949, I was 33 years old. I had 4 years in the Canadian Army and 3 subsequent seasons with the Topographical Survey, and I was hired on to Station 14 through a second-floor office in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, that smelled of pipe tobacco and the iodine they put on the maps to bring out the contour lines. The pay was $110 a month plus rations, which was respectable money that summer for a man who still owed his sister for passage home from Halifax after the war. I did not know the country we were going into. I had done ridge and valley work on the Gaspé Peninsula and in the Chickchocks, and I believed, incorrectly, that Labrador would be more of the same. The recruiting officer was a clerk named Pell, who explained the terms twice and asked me to sign 3 carbon copies of a standard field contract. He did not explain, and I did not think to ask, why Station 14 was being surveyed in the 3rd week of August rather than in June when the weather was reliable. He did not mention that the previous Dominion crew scheduled to occupy the ridge had turned back at Goose Bay without explanation in the 2nd week of July. I learned that detail only afterward, from a bush pilot in a beer parlor, and by then it no longer changed anything. I signed for 17 days at Station 14. I came back on the 8th morning after I signed, minus 1 man we never found. Ridley Corwin, our chief surveyor, was 54 that August and had been doing Dominion work since before the First War. He was tall and thin, with a face weathered to the color of oiled cedar, and he wore the same wool mackinaw from sun-up to the first proper frost, regardless of the day's temperature. He spoke in short, complete sentences, did not explain himself twice, and kept his personal effects in a single canvas satchel that he never let another man carry. He was the kind of foreman who commanded authority by never needing to claim it. Under him were Thorne Hutchison, 42, radio operator and secondary instrument man, a former naval signals rating from Halifax, with a notebook habit that would become our most important record. Matthias Pelletier, 24, axeman and chainman, a Quebecois kid out of Rimouski, who filled every quiet moment with talk, and whose nervousness I did not correctly read until it was too late. Silas Benoit, 61, a Métis guide and trapper hired locally at Goose Bay, who had walked the country between the Naskau P and the Kanariktok since before any of us knew the names of those rivers. And 8 other men, whose names I will not set down here, because 3 of them are still alive, and the other 5 left no family to be hurt by the details. We were a competent crew. We were a well-equipped crew. We were not the kind of men who frighten easily, and we were not, in the ordinary course of things, the kind of men who lose their nerve. The very first thing I noticed, within an hour of our Norsemen tipping us out onto the shore of Tessick Brook with our crates, was that the previous occupants of Station 14 had left behind equipment that no working surveyor leaves behind voluntarily. The supply tent, which had not been struck, contained a nearly full case of .303 British ammunition, a Lee Enfield No. 4 rifle in serviceable condition, leaning unloaded against a center pole, a brass telescoping level in its fitted wooden box, a pair of calfskin leveler's gloves folded neatly on top of the box, and on a ration crate, facing outward as though someone had set it there to be read, a small leather-bound field journal whose last entry was dated the 3rd of July, 1949. I did not open the journal on that first day. Something in me, something I credit to 4 winters of sentry duty on the North Sea coast, told me to leave it alone until I understood the ground better. But I noted its presence, and I noted that the rifle was a personal weapon rather than a government issue. A name scratched into the stock by a pocket knife, 2 initials, and a year. Men do not leave personal rifles in unlocked tents in country like this. They do not leave calfskin gloves and half a case of ammunition unless they left in such a particular kind of hurry that the calculation of what to carry and what to leave was not made at all. I did not share my observations with Corwin. I believe now that I should have. I believe I was reading the ground correctly and losing my nerve at the moment of reporting it. On the morning of our 3rd day, the 7th of August, Silas Benoit was standing at the south edge of our clearing, about 20 feet from where I was unpacking stadia rods, and he was listening to something I had not yet heard. I asked him what it was. He held up one finger, the way an older man asks a younger man to be quiet without taking offense, and he listened for perhaps another 30 seconds. Then he walked over to where I was working, and he said, in the soft mixture of English and Montagnais French he used when he was thinking carefully, that the Grey Jay call coming from the southwest had too many notes in it. Those are his words, translated as closely as I can manage. Too many notes. I asked him what that meant. He said a Grey Jay makes a call of 3 or sometimes 4 descending notes, and that what he was hearing had 6, and that the 6th note was held longer than any bird would hold it. He said it in the same tone he would have used to tell me the barometer was falling. He did not say what he thought was producing the sound. I asked if it might be a different bird. He shook his head once. Then he said, "I have been listening to birds in this country for 51 years." And he walked off to check on the horses. We did not have, because they could not have been flown in, and I understood that I was not to press the question. I should have pressed it. I did not. On the morning of our 5th day, we found that the theodolite had moved. I will be precise about what I mean by this, because precision is the only thing that keeps this story from dissolving into the kind of account nobody has to take seriously. The instrument had been set up the previous evening on its tripod over a temporary wooden cross stake, leveled and covered in its canvas hood against the dew. We do this every night. The tripod legs had been planted firmly in the moss on the south side of our clearing. When Thorne and I went to uncover the instrument at 6 in the morning for the day's first angle shots, the tripod had moved approximately 16 inches northwest of its original position. The wooden cross stake was still where we had driven it the night before. The hood was still on. The instrument was still level, remarkably level, more level in fact than when we had set it. And the tripod feet had left a clear impression in the moss at the original position, and a second, lighter impression at the new position. Nothing had been dragged. There was no scuff, no torn moss, no indication that either man or animal had walked between the two positions. The instrument had been lifted, moved approximately 16 inches, and set down with enough care to preserve its level. I do not offer an explanation for this. I only report that it happened, that both Thorne and I witnessed the before and after, and that Ridley Corwin, when we reported it, did not say a single word for close to a minute before he instructed us to reset the cross stake and to say nothing about it to any of the others. Thorne Hutchison was not in the habit of keeping a personal journal. He kept a radio log and an instrument log, which were Dominion property and which followed prescribed formats, but he did not write down his personal thoughts on work time. On the night of the 8th of August, after the theodolite incident, he began a separate notebook in his own hand, on the lined pages of a small field notebook he had brought from Halifax for correspondence with his wife. He wrote at the top of the first entry, in the careful, precise letters of a man who had taken down wartime signal traffic under fire, the single word, observations, and the date. Underneath, he recorded, in numbered entries with times, every departure from the ordinary he could identify at Station 14 from that night forward. He showed me the notebook for the first time on the 11th of August, after supper, when the two of us were at the far end of the clearing away from the fire, and he laid it open on a crate and said, "Evan, I am writing this down because I do not trust my memory in this country any longer, and I want at least one other man to know it exists." Those were his exact words. I read what he had at that point, and he was keeping it in plain, unadorned English, as he had been taught to keep signal traffic, and there was nothing editorialized, just times, positions, weather, sounds heard, movement observed, things out of place. I told him I thought he was doing the right thing. He asked me to mention the notebook to nobody, not even to Corwin. I agreed. That notebook is the source of the exact times I am giving you in what follows. Matthias Peltier went down to the brook on the afternoon of the 10th of August to fill the cook's water pails. He had done this every afternoon since our arrival. The brook ran about 300 yards northeast of the clearing, through a shallow cut in the ridge, and a man could make the round trip in 12 minutes at an easy pace. That afternoon, he was gone for close to 40. When he came back up the rise with the pails, he was walking more slowly than the full weight of the water could account for, and when he set the pails down by the cook's crate, he did not speak. He looked at me, at Hutchison, at the fire, and then he walked past all of us to his bedroll and sat down on it without taking off his boots. I followed him over after a minute. I asked him if he was all right. He told me, in the very quiet French he used only when he was speaking to himself or to his mother in a letter, that there had been something standing on the far bank of the brook, in among the spruce, tall and very thin and pale as wet clay, not moving at all, and that when he had lifted his eyes from the water pail the second time to check again, it had been standing maybe 10 feet closer to the water than it had been the first time. He said he had not seen it move. He said he did not think it had wanted him to see it move. He said he did not go back to the brook alone again. And he did not. On the night of the 11th of August, at 8 minutes past 9 o'clock, 4 of us saw it standing at the edge of our firelight, on the south side of the clearing, between 2 trees, whose trunks I remember as clearly as I remember my own mother's face. I will describe it as I saw it. It was tall. I am 6 feet and 1/2 inch in my boots, and even allowing for the tendency of men to overestimate the height of a thing that frightens them, I put it at 7.5 feet minimum, likely more. It was narrow in a way that was difficult to reconcile with its height. The shoulders were not broad. The torso was long. The arms hung lower along the body than a man's arms hang. Its surface appeared dry and pale in the firelight, the color of weathered bone or of wet birch bark after it has gone gray. Its face, at 60 yards, I could not read in detail, but the head was small in proportion to the length of the body, and set on a neck that was too long by perhaps a third. It was not moving. It was not breathing that any of us could detect. Ridley Corwin had his Winchester in his hands within 2 seconds of seeing it. He did not raise the rifle. I want you to mark that. A man of his background, with 30 years of experience in country where hostile wildlife is a daily hazard, had his weapon in his hands and did not raise it. He stood and watched. And the thing, for roughly 3 minutes, stood and watched him back. Then it turned, walked south, and was gone. At the morning muster on the 12th of August, Ridley Corwin made a rule. He stood at the head of the crate that served as our paperwork table, and he announced, in the same level voice he used for every instruction he had ever given, that no man was to cross the Tessock Brook for any reason between sundown and sunrise, and that no man was to go to the brook alone at any hour without a second man in visual contact. He did not explain the reason. He did not need to. Every man at the muster had either seen the thing at the firelight the previous evening or had been told about it by someone who had. He also said, more quietly, that any man who wished to pull off the job and wait for the next scheduled float plane, which was not due for another 6 days, was welcome to do so without any loss of wages or standing, and that no questions would be asked of such a man. He looked each of us in the face when he said that. 3 men looked away. One of them, a chainman from Sydney, whose full name I have decided not to set down here, said immediately that he was staying, that he was not going to be the man who walked off a Dominion contract because of something he had seen in a fog. The other 2 said nothing. They stayed as well. Nobody chose to wait for the float plane. I have thought about that decision, my own and the others, more often in the last 40 years than any other decision I made in my life. and I still cannot tell you exactly why we all stayed. The vocalizations came back on the night of the 13th of August. They were not the altered J call from Silas's morning a week earlier. These were lower, longer, and came in a slow rhythm that had no natural match I could place. They started sometime after 11 from the south and continued for perhaps 20 minutes. Then a second source began from the southeast, maybe 3/4 of a mile from the first, and the two of them went back and forth for close to an hour, each one allowing the other to finish its phrase before beginning its own. I lay in my bedroll and I listened, and I tried to find an explanation that would let me sleep, and I could not find one. Silas got up once, went to the tent flap, and stood there looking south into the dark for maybe 5 minutes, then came back and sat on his bedroll with his rifle across his knees for the rest of the night. He did not lie back down. Hutchison's notebook for that night has the entry 2314. 2 sources, southerly and southeasterly, low register, alternating in measured sequence, pattern consistent with turn-taking. That is the phrase he used, turn-taking. In his Navy signal training, that phrase had a specific meaning. 2 stations in communication with each other, each acknowledging the other. And I believe Thorne chose that phrase with full awareness of its implications. I do not know what was communicating with what that night. I am certain that something was. On the morning of the 14th of August, the morning of the night that would make me stop writing in my own journal for 6 months afterward, we found that 7 survey stakes along the south boundary line had been pulled out of the ground. The holes were there, clean-edged, the moss pushed up in little berms around each one in the way it pushes up when a stake is drawn straight out with a vertical pull. The stakes themselves had been carried approximately 15 feet east of the line and laid crosswise on top of each other in a small, neat pile, alternating north-south and east-west in the way a man stacks kindling. Nothing was broken. Nothing was splintered. The pile had been arranged with care. Corwin walked the line with me and Silas and did not speak for the first part of the inspection. When he finally did speak, it was to ask Silas, very quietly, whether he had ever in his 61 years in this country seen an animal do a thing like this. Silas looked at the stack for a long moment. Then he said, in English, the single sentence, "No animal stacks wood." And then he said, in the French dialect he used with his grandchildren, a phrase I did not fully understand at the time, but which I later learned meant, roughly, "It is showing us that it can do the work of our hands." Corwin did not respond. He walked back to camp, and when we reached the clearing, he told Thorne to try the radio every hour from dusk to first light, that he wanted the float plane brought in as soon as atmospheric conditions permitted, and that we were to begin packing non-essential gear that afternoon. Silas and I found the second set of prints on the afternoon of the 14th, approximately half a mile northwest of camp, in a patch of soft muskeg beside a game trail neither of us had walked before. There were 4 clear impressions in a slightly irregular line heading westward into denser spruce. They were the same shape as the depressions Silas had shown me 2 days earlier on the South Flat. Oblong, narrow at what I will call the heel, pressed deep, no toe articulation visible. But these were measurably smaller. Silas laid his open palm flat beside the clearest print, as I have seen him do many times to estimate the size of bear sign. The first set we had measured ran longer than the length of his palm from heel of hand to fingertip. This set was about 3/4 of that. Not a young one, he told me, in the same soft French he used with Matthias when he was thinking through something hard. Not young, just a smaller one. Then he said that there was more than one of them in this country, and that he should have told Corwin this on the first day, because he had suspected it on the first day from something he had seen near the brook that he had not yet reported. I asked him what he had seen near the brook. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Evan, I will tell you later, when we are off this ridge. It is bad luck to say it here." We walked back to camp in silence. He did not tell me that afternoon. He never told me. From just after dusk on the 14th, Thorne Hutchison sat at that radio and worked the band. He wore his headphones. He kept one hand on the fine-tuning dial and the other on a pencil resting against the page of his instrument log. He spoke into the microphone every 7 minutes exactly, using the Dominion recognition protocol and the registered call sign assigned to Station 14. For the first 3 hours, he received nothing but the hiss of a country too far from other countries. At approximately 11:30, he got a fragment of traffic that sounded like Goose Bay, but that cut out before he could confirm it. At 12:04, he raised a voice he recognized, a radio man named Corbeil in Goose Bay, whom he had spoken with in June on a band test, and he passed the message in Dominion code and in clear text together. The word "evacuate" repeated 3 times with our call sign and coordinates, and the request for floatplane extraction at first light of the 16th, weather permitting. Corbeil acknowledged. The window closed a minute later. Thorne lifted the headphones off his ears with both hands, set them down on the crate with the precision of a man handling something fragile, and sat for a long time, not looking at anyone. Then he walked outside the tent, and I saw him put his hands on his knees and lean forward, the way a man does when he has been holding his breath for a long time without realizing it. I went out and stood near him and did not speak. After a while, he straightened and said, "I have never been so grateful to hear Corbeil's voice in my life, and I have never been so afraid that it was the last voice I would hear." I want to tell you carefully what happened between 27 minutes past 9 and 34 minutes past 9 on the evening of the 14th of August, 1949, because it is the thing that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. I was sitting on a log by the cook fire. Corwin was on the far side of the fire with his rifle across his knees. Hutchison was in the instrument tent at the radio. Silas had just stood up to walk to the latrine. Matthias was feeding wood into the stove. It came into the camp from the south side, between 2 tents, with no sound at all. No footfall, no breath, no rustle of a branch against its body. It simply was not in the camp. And then it was. It stopped approximately 20 feet from the cook fire, on the far side of a supply crate, and it stood looking at Corwin. This time I could see its face in the firelight. It was not a face in the way a man's face or a bear's face is a face. It was flat in the middle, with features that did not quite match the places where features belong on a face I had been raised to recognize. The eyes caught the firelight and reflected it back without color. A pale, hard shine like the reflection off wet river stone. It looked at Corwin for what Hutchison's notebook records as 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Then it turned its head, not its body, only the head, and it looked directly at me. And for 10 seconds I understood, with complete and entirely unwelcome clarity, that I was being counted. Not watched. Counted. Corwin gave the order in a normal speaking voice. He said, "All right, boys, take it down." And he brought the Winchester up and fired his first round at the chest of the thing at a range I later paced off at 43 feet. The bullet hit. I heard it hit. The thing rocked back perhaps 4 inches and straightened. Corwin levered and fired again. Hit. Same result. Silas came around from the latrine side of the camp with his Lee Enfield already at his shoulder and fired twice more, deliberate, aimed shots at the center of mass. Both hits. No effect beyond that small backward rock. Then the rest of us opened up, and the camp filled with noise. I fired 3 rounds from my own Lee Enfield. Hutchison had come out of the instrument tent with his rifle and fired at least 2. Matthias fired once and then could not work the bolt a second time because his hands were shaking too hard. I counted at the time, and I counted again later against Thorne's notebook, and the total we put into it was between 11 and 14 rounds, at a range no shooter in our crew would have missed under ordinary conditions. We did not miss. We heard every bullet hit. Not one of us could identify a single exit wound, a single tear in its skin, a single bead of any fluid coming out of it. At the end of the firing, the thing was standing perhaps 12 feet back from where it had been when Corwin gave the order. It had not fallen. It had not even changed what it was doing with its head, which was still turned to look at us, one at a time, in sequence. I want you to understand what I mean when I say unhurried. After the last of our rifles fell silent, there was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds in which the thing simply stood and none of us moved, and the camp was held in a silence so complete I could hear the pine resin popping in the cook fire behind me. Then the thing turned. The turn was smooth and unhurried, in the way a man steps back from a table he has finished eating at. It began to walk back toward the south end of the clearing from which it had entered. Its stride was too long for its height, and the head did not bob the way a human head bobs with a walking gait. It moved with a quality I can only describe as efficient. It covered the distance from its standing position to the edge of the firelight in, by Hutchison's count, with the second hand of his watch, 9 seconds. 9 seconds to traverse a distance that a man walking normally would cover in perhaps 18 or 20. At the edge of the firelight, it did not look back. It stepped between 2 spruce trunks, and it was gone. The fog had thickened during the shooting without any of us noticing, and within 3 or 4 additional seconds, the place where it had disappeared was no longer visually distinguishable from any other place along the south edge of the clearing. We stood in the firelight with our rifles slack in our hands, and nobody reloaded, and nobody spoke, and nobody moved except Silas, who sat down very slowly on a log and put his face in his hands for maybe half a minute. At first light on the 15th of August, 3 men informed Corwin that they were walking out. They did not ask for the float plane. They did not wait for atmospheric conditions or the window the next night. They took their packs and their personal rifles, and they started up the cut line toward the Churchill River drainage on foot, with the understanding that a man walking that country at that time of year in reasonable health and with reasonable supplies could expect to reach a Grenfell mission station in 5 to 7 days if nothing went wrong. Corwin did not try to stop them. He wished each of them good luck and shook their hands at the edge of the clearing. And I saw that his hands were steady when he did it, which I took as a kindness to the 3 men who were leaving. Silas and Hutchison and Matthias and I and the remaining 4 men stayed. The plan was the float plane, at first light of the 16th, if Corbet could arrange the pilot. Somewhere between mid-morning and noon on the 15th, one of the 4 men who had stayed, I will not name him here, though he was the chainman from Sydney, who had said the night before that he was not going to walk off a Dominion contract, went out of sight briefly on the latrine path, and did not come back. We searched. Silas tracked him to the latrine, where there were his prints, and from the latrine we found his prints leading south toward the brook for approximately 90 yards, and then the prints ended in soft moss, with no continuation in any direction. We did not find him. We are, the survivors, reasonably certain that he was not a man who chose to walk away. The night of the 15th of August was the worst of the 12 I spent at Station 14. And I want you to understand why. Nothing happened. There were no vocalizations from the south or the southeast. There were no movements at the perimeter, no sounds at the cook tent, no disturbances at the instrument line. The fog that had been present off and on for a week lay flat and heavy over the muskeg and did not shift. The spruce did not creak. No owl called. No fox cried. No mosquito hummed near my face, which in August in that country is a thing I had never before experienced in my life. The entire country had gone still, the way a room goes still when one person in it has stopped breathing. I sat up in my bedroll against a tent pole with my Lee Enfield across my knees for most of that night, and I listened to a silence so complete that my own heartbeat sounded to me like someone walking in heavy boots inside my own chest. And the thing I understood, somewhere around 2 in the morning, was that the quiet was not an absence. The quiet was a decision. The quiet was the thing choosing not to come back tonight, because it no longer needed to. It had already counted us. It had already established that our weapons did not work against it in the way weapons were supposed to work. It had already taken the man from the latrine path without any of us seeing how. The rest of us, the 9 remaining, were only staying alive now because it had not yet decided otherwise. And that was a much worse kind of safety than the kind I had been raised to believe in. The Norseman came in at 6:40 on the morning of the 16th of August. The pilot was a man named Ewan McAllister, whom none of us had met before. He put the plane down on the stretch of Tessick Brook that broadens into an unnamed pond about half a mile north of the clearing, taxied up to the clay shore we had used as our supply dock, and kept his engine idling while we loaded. He did not leave the cockpit. He understood, I believe, something of what had happened on the ridge, though Corbeil in Goose Bay had been given only the coded word "evacuate" and the call sign. Pilots in that country, in that year, had a way of knowing when a question was not to be asked. We loaded the theodolite, the radio, our personal gear, and Thorne's 2 notebooks. We left the cement, most of the ration crates, the stakes, the Lee Enfield from the previous crew's tent with its initials in the stock, and the leather journal we had found on the first day, which Corwin had finally read on the evening of the 15th and had put back on the crate, closed, facing outward the way we had found it. I watched him do that. I did not ask him what was in it. I still do not know. Silas climbed into the Norseman last and paused at the pontoon step with his pack on his shoulder, and turned once to look up toward the ridge. He stood for perhaps 15 seconds. Then he stepped up into the plane and sat down without saying anything, and McAllister eased the throttle up, and we lifted off the water into a pearl gray sky, and none of us looked back again. The Dominion Topographical Survey filed its official report on Station 14 in October of 1949. I have a carbon of it. It runs to 3.5 typed pages. It attributes the abandonment of the station to, in the report's exact language, deteriorating weather conditions and an incident of field illness of unknown etiology affecting multiple crew members. And it notes that the triangulation data obtained from Station 14 were incomplete but judged sufficient for the provisional chart. The report does not mention the thing we saw at the firelight on the 11th, or the vocalizations on the 13th, or the shooting on the 14th, or the man from the latrine path on the 15th. I learned later, not from anyone in Ottawa, but from a clerk in the Corner Brook Regional Office over a drink in 1954, that Ridley Corwin had filed a second and considerably longer report the week after our return, marked for the eyes of the chief surveyor only, which had been read once by one senior official and then placed in a sealed file with a notation that it was not to be included in the public record or quoted in any subsequent departmental correspondence. That second report exists somewhere. I have never seen it. The missing chainman from Sydney was listed as having died of exposure while attempting to walk out from the station against the advice of the crew chief, and his small pension was paid to a sister in Halifax. The case was closed administratively in January of 1950. The ridge was not resurveyed for the triangulation network. The triangulation station at Station 14 was moved, in the final chart, to a different ridge 9 miles to the northeast. I am 74 years old now, writing this at the kitchen table of a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, with Thorne Hutchison's field notebook open in front of me. Thorne sent it to me in 1983, 2 months before he died, with a short letter asking me to keep it and, if I ever felt the need, to write down what had happened on the ridge in my own words, because he had tried twice and had not been able to finish either attempt. Silas Benoit died in 1967 at a Grenfell hospital in Labrador. Matthias Pelletier left the survey within a year of our return and went back to Rimouski, where he worked in his father's hardware store for the rest of his life and, to my knowledge, never once spoke of Station 14 to anyone outside his confessor. Ridley Corwin lived until 1971, spent his retirement on a small farm in southern Ontario, and never did field work for the Dominion again. When young people ask me now what I think the thing was, I tell them that I am not a man who has a theory for everything, and that in the matter of the ridge above Tessick Brook, I have made my peace with not having an explanation that fits the facts. I will say this. I have read, in the years since, a number of older accounts from Innu and Naskapi oral tradition, collected by missionaries in the last century, of a tall, pale thing that walks out of the muskeg at the edges of the long country between the great rivers, and that is said to count the men at a camp before it decides what it will do with them. Every generation that presses into that country seems to find its own version. I know what I saw in August of 1949. I know that every man who was on that ridge and was still alive in 1990 had the same account of the essentials, to the minute, to the round of rifle fire, to the silence of the 15th. I'm going to close this account the way Thorne Hutchison asked me to close it, which is to say, without trying to convince anyone of anything. You have listened to a long story told by an old man in a quiet apartment. You are free to take from it what fits your sense of the world and to set the rest aside. But I will say one last thing, and then I will put down my pen and pour myself a small glass of rye and sit with the dark beyond my window for a while. Because the dark beyond my window has not troubled me in 41 years, and I would like to keep it that way. If you have, in your own family, a document like the one Thorne Hutchison kept in the summer of 1949, a field journal, a folded letter, a carbon of a report, a photograph with a figure at the edge of it that nobody in your family has ever been able to identify, I would be grateful if you would say so. You do not need to send it anywhere. You do not need to prove anything. Only, if you are comfortable doing so, write a few lines about what you have. Somewhere people who care about these things will read it. There are more of us than you think, and we are quieter than we should be. And the country we walked into in those years has not been emptied of anything that was in it. Subscribe, if you are inclined, for more of these accounts, and leave a light on somewhere tonight for the men who did not walk out of the ridge country, whichever ridge country was theirs. Good night. Thank you for listening.